Welcome everybody to the first of the GeoHeritage month-end talks. We're going to have last Wednesday of every month except for December. We're going to have a GeoHeritage meeting, and this is the first of those from Roger. During our GeoHeritage month, we had a couple of talks. Quite a few talks, among them some talks from our brand ambassadors, because the brand of the GeoHeritage Division is Earth and Life, the story of Earth and Life. And the mission is telling the story of Earth and Life, and the vision is telling the story of Earth and Life to all South Africans and to the world. So today, Roger's going to tell us about the stories in the Bushveld complex. Been on a few field trips with Roger to the Bushveld complex, but the one I most remember is one where Roger field trip to Zimbabwe, where Roger made some improper remarks when I said I was standing with 1 foot on 2.3 billion rocks and the other foot on 3.3 billion, and Roger said something impolite. But Roger's promised us he won't say anything impolite today. He's going to tell us about geoheritage and geotourism in the eastern limb of the Bushveld complex. Over to you, Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and welcome everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. So, as you can guess, it's a very lightweight talk on the eastern limb with just a few little bits of geological ideas thrown in to keep it going. It's very much on the geoheritage and the geotourism opportunities. And as most of you would know, a nice picture of the chromite layers in the footwall of the UG1 on the first slide. So if I advance my slide, now it's decided not to advance, which is a good start. Oh, there we go. So the eastern limb is well known for some classic sort of rugged landscapes. I've often thought it was unfortunate that the national park wasn't created in this area when they created the Kruger. Obviously, with the support of the people, would have been great, because it's got fantastic scenery with lots of rolling hills and escarpments and valleys, all of which are controlled by the geology, as all of you would know. I guess it's particularly famous for the classic igneous layering, which is only one part of the intrusion, but this is really what makes it famous. And this is an example of an anorthosite layer intercalated with pyroxenites. And this sort of layer can be traced to 70, 80 kilometers along strike. And clearly, we still don't really know how igneous layering develops. It might well be one of the most significant parts of geological science at the moment, where we've really got a blind spot, I think, on a lot of the processes which we believe happen in these layered intrusions, but there's no consensus and no really clear views in some ways. And a couple of acknowledgements to start with. This idea of a geopark or a geotrail in the eastern limb, Morris, Villon and myself have been talking about it for 20 years or so. And we published last year a paper which I've referenced there, and the idea being is that paper could be used as a sort of framework to get something going. So the Geological Society could essentially take it over from us and maybe get a group of younger people involved to get this off the ground. And the article would just be a sort of a framework, as I said. It doesn't have to be followed closely, of course. And then the other thing is I've been doing ongoing research with Andrew Mitchell over sort of almost 40 years. A lot of our work has been in the eastern limb, and that's still going. So many of the ideas that I might mention have been developed with Andrew. And we've come up with some pretty new ideas, I think, where we believe the Merensky reef is injected as a sill, and that causes partial melting of the norite and the anorthosite. And also the Donite pipes, there's melting around the Donite pipes as well, which hasn't really been picked up before. And we've also talked about how we believe that the magma chamber was probably a very small tabular feature that was replenished multiple times, even during formation of the upper zone. And of course, none of these ideas are particularly widely accepted, but that's just the way our research has been going in recent years. And as a general comment on the eastern limb, it's unique with respect to its accessibility. And as all of us know in South Africa, we're very lucky to have these fantastic road networks. And then the exposures of igneous layering. Many of the other famous layered intrusions like Skaergaard in Greenland, even Rum in Scotland, and many of the other areas, they're relatively inaccessible. And I think we forget in a way how easy it is to get around our lovely country. You know, to go with the negative thoughts, lots of positive features as well. And the geosites are actually regularly visited by international geoscientists. Often people come here on their own to visit. They don't always come just on groups. And Morris has been quite, this is sort of idea really from Morris, that the geotourism can be linked to the well-established tourism of the Eastern Escarpment and the Kruger National Park. And he's got a field trip guide from IGC 2016 with that in mind, which covers all three areas, which would, I believe, is an excellent idea. And we've argued that the action is required to preserve geosites from both mining and rural development. There's a lot of people in the area. And we could create geological traverses with boardwalks for exposures. And one thing that I've picked up from visiting national parks is that one can train up local guides quite easily to explain what we might originally think to be quite complicated geological features. And in that way, one could bring in the local community, and one could have guides available on many of the traverses that we select. And there's also historical mining sites, which include the Moyhood Pike, where economic platinum was first discovered in the Bushveld, and the Ommelwaard Pike, which is generally recognized to be the world's oldest underground platinum mine. The operations in Russia, which are a little bit older, were mostly alluvial and a few surface scratchings, but not a modern mine as Ommelwaard was. Many of these places, you know, would make superb geoheritage sites with support of the mining companies to get something going. And obviously the local community is key to the whole thing. And I believe that one could establish a tourist center in the region, and we could even have underground visits on the old workings on the Merensky reef, and maybe at the Vinasip locality, and maybe try to create a sort of platinum reef city. Well, it's not a shaft, one just walks down the declines. But I think it's all possible if we get our heads together. And something that Morris and I have talked about quite often is overseas, how old mines in Europe and North America actually have phenomenal numbers of visits. Just the slate quarries in the English Lake District, there's hundreds of thousands of people visit every year, and generates a lot of money into local communities. And I think this is a side of geology, which I guess many of you will actually agree with. We've overlooked for many years. So the idea here is, do we have a geopark or a geotrail? A geopark, of course, definition by Wikipedia, which you guys can read. It might be a little bit too formal because of the rural community is relatively large in this area. But a geotrail could work very well, obviously with the support of the communities and the mining companies. And we can select geosites, get information boards and booklets together, I guess relatively easily. And we've got an advantage in the area because the Dwars River site is already a national monument. So if the government or the local community, to help convince them, this might be an advantage that at least there is one site in the area which people do visit. Okay, decided not to advance again. There we go. So just a map, something that all of you are familiar with. We don't need to spend much time on it, but most of the geosites in the Eastern Limb are in that boxed area. It's not the entire limb outcrops. And one of the geosites that I've identified is G17, is the best exposure of the Rooiberg Fell site is outside the area, but all the other sites are in that area. And if we look at the legend on the top left, I think all of you realize that there's 3 components in the intrusion, and we could even say 4 to include the metamorphic aureole as well. But most of the sites I've restricted to the talk here are within the Rustenburg layered suite, the unit shown in green. And this is a nice map that Morris put together for our 2019 paper. And it shows some of the physiographic features of the area. And what we've argued is that everybody is aware that we have a low felt and a high felt, but a lot of people aren't really fully aware that we have a middle felt, because the middle felt is often known as the Bushveld in a geographic sense rather than a geological sense. And a lot of the development of the middle felt is really related to the Bushveld complex and the metamorphic oriole. So the oriole rocks make the big mountains up in the north of the area up here, and the local range is Stradeport Berg, but we referred to the main area as the Eastern Escarpment, and that would be equivalent to the to the Great Escarpment, which encircles all of the subcontinent, of course. But within the intrusion in this sort of area here, one can identify a whole range of ridges and valleys, each of which are controlled by the geological features of the eastern limb. So the Oliphants, Motsi, and Stillport are the main valleys, and that's where the different marginal zone, lower zone, and critical zones outcrop. And then the Yolo Mountains is a subsidiary escarpment, which we've come up with the name here. My mouse is sticking, unfortunate. Shown in yellow, almost next to the Yolo Mountains, that yellow line. We've come up with the idea of calling it a Bushveld escarpment, and that escarpment is restricted to the Bushveld, the eastern limb of the Bushveld, so you don't get it in other parts of the country. And it gives you some idea of how big the Bushveld complex is and how it's affected the geomorphology of the region as well. And then the interior plateau on the left of the image, on the west side, is mostly associated with the upper zone. Just a quick recap on the different zones. I think most of you would be familiar with it, but assume we take the marginal zone as a proper zone. Then there's 5 zones: lower, critical, main, upper, with a critical and main zone subdivided as well. And then all of the different marker layers. We could just pick out the Merensky reef as the most important one, which we'll talk about in some detail here. And as you guys know, the chromatites in the critical zone here and the magnetite layers in the upper zone over here. Another image which Morris produced, a false color satellite image, and we can now see how the different zones can be picked up on these regional maps actually quite easily. You can see the different colors. The floor contact and the roof contact are relatively clear, and the mountains in the metamorphic oriole in the northeast of the image come over very distinct. There's also some floor rock domes up in the upper zone over here. These we call them floor rock domes because they're not xenoliths, as was thought for many years. Sharp and Chadwick in an article many years ago proposed that they're actually floor attached structures. So this doming is a huge feature in the region, which was not recognized for many years. And you can see the Bushveld escarpment, if we traced it, it's in the main zone, not at the base of the main zone. It's a few hundred meters up into the main zone where the change from norite to gabbro norite comes in. And you can see you can trace it all the way along. And then on the right, just a few photographs. The copies in the middle, I'll show you some pictures of those in a minute. They're at Vinar Sup, by the Merensky Reef, and you can even see the 2 copies, just little green dots by the pointer there. And the one on the bottom right, which I think is Morris's picture actually, shows fantastic igneous layering just north of Steelport, where the Winterfeld chrome mine or eastern chrome mines are. The layering of pyroxenites and norites, mostly in the upper critical zone, with the LG6 occurring close to the bottom of the hill. So this is a section, very schematic section from the far northern bit of the area we're talking about, showing one of these domes, but it also shows domes in the lower zone on the right of the section. And the feeling that Andrew Mitchell and I've got is that the floor of the eastern limb would be like a giant egg box. There are literally hundreds of domes, we believe, that just haven't been picked up from surface or geophysical work, and so that the structure is far more complex than maybe is generally appreciated. The metamorphic aureole, just to show you some typical pictures of quartzite in the floor rocks. And the idea being is that the tilt is induced by the loading and heating of the bushveld, and the fact that there's a big thick lower zone in this area has created a relatively high temperature aureole. And these are some of the geosites that we identified in our paper. And on the left, I've just picked out a few important ones that we can refer to as the talk develops. G10 is Dwars River, the UG1, the national monument. The G14, the Oliphants River Trough, where the section line is. And then G29 is the Zati Valley. And then the Moyhook Pipe, the Omvavat Pipe, Merensky Reef at Vinasuk. But of course, you know, and I numbered them, by the way, from alphabetically, but, you know, I thought of doing it from north to south, but one could take advice from other people once the concept, or if the concept gets going. So if we look at a more detailed map, there's the section line up in the top. That's where the section was drawn through that Oliphants River area. And the G10 would be, you know, down the sticky mouse. G10 would be down here, and then the Merensky Reef on Vinasuk would be here. And I guess you can pick out the yellow ones yourselves, or look at it in detail later on. But these were the main sites which we tend to take the international field trips to. And I think from a geotrail point of view, the nicest thing is to have trails, and this Oliphants River area there's a nice section, and as many of you know, you can walk, you know, for sort of several kilometers, you know, to see a good range of rocks in the one area. This is a satellite image with a vertical exaggeration 2 times, and we're basically looking due north down the Dwars River Valley. So the Dwars, the national monument, would be where the 2 rivers meet just here. And I've highlighted the Zati Valley, which is up in the main zone mountains, just for reasons which we'll talk later on. But you can see the floor contact and the roof contact come over very clearly. Here's the Bushveld escarpment that we were talking about before in the Steelport Valley section. And then when you go into the northern bit in the Oliphants and Motsi Valley, then the escarpment is associated with the base of the Liolo Mountains. And if you fly over those mountains, by the way, in these areas, on a scale, this would be about 20 kilometers east to west. It's rugged, uninhabited country. It's an amazing part of the country, which is just not very widely visited. And there's few roads through it, which is clearly why. And the one road is where the pointer is at the moment, which is access from that Zati Valley going up the hill there. And the key point on the image shows how the lower zone at Burgess Fort, which is over here, Burgess Fort with the B, yeah, this mouse is sticking, but Burgess Fort here. So and we call these big bulges of lower zone rocks as the Burgess Fort bulge, and then there would be a Clapham bulge with the lower zone here, and then the Oliphants River, the one further north. So the lower zone restricted to these 3 areas. And I think this image shows it maybe better than on the maps, you know, how these are almost separate early formed compartments of the eastern limb. Again, the idea that it could never have been one big magma chamber. It's developed incrementally, probably over 2 or 3 million years. A little bit of a close-up of the image just to show where the Dwars River site is. Other areas that people might know would be the Kennedy's Vale magnetite vanadium mine would be here. This is one of these classic cone-shaped coppers that you always see in the road next to on the road to Steelport. It's got one of the IRAPs, these iron-rich pegmatites in the at the crest of the hill, and over here is the Motsi Valley, and then the Vinasuk Merensky workings here, and those are those twin copies that I showed you the pictures earlier on. So you can see there's a lot of information on these images, and the interesting thing is, which I like to point out on field trips, is every valley and every copy and every ridge is telling a story about the regional geology, which is fascinating. It doesn't always work that well in many other areas. See if we can move on again. Yeah, so the Zati Valley has got a heritage site, the Zati Heritage Site. It was originally spelled DSJATE on the geological maps, but the locals describe it as Zate, and I think they've sort of changed the name, and I guess we should fit in with the local community. For those interested, it's a weird name, and it was because the farm was originally owned by Mr. D.S. Jate, and Jate is an English name for people who aren't familiar. So, and they somehow joined his initials with his surname to make this unpronounceable name. And the information in the area is a fascinating history of the indigenous people who've occupied this area for long periods of history. The Khoisan would have been there for tens of thousands of years. There are rock paintings in the area, I believe, although I've never seen them. And the Bantu-speaking people maybe moved in the African Iron Age. There's quite a lot of interesting sites which archaeologists have identified. And then somewhere in the 19th century, King Sekwati and his son Sukukuni formed the Pedi Empire. And this is quite a large group of people, a very well-organized indigenous community. And during that period, a missionary station was established in the valley by Alexander Merensky in 1861, who was Hans Merensky's father, for the people who aren't familiar with the discovery story. And the Pedi Empire had a very fractious relationship with some of the early settlers in the regions. And the British troops, strangely enough, were called in with Swazi warriors in 1879 to the sort of subjugation, a typical British colonial war, I'm afraid. But I say it's strange because this was before the Union of South Africa, and this area and the settlers being attacked or their cattle being stolen were obviously people from the original Transvaal Dutch Republic. So exactly how the British got involved, I've never really managed to dig that up. Pictures on the right show the entrance to the memorial and some of these classic copies with memorial stones. It's all in gabbro norite of the main zone, rather fantastic locality. And then the last point, there's another important archaeological site further south in the region, Mapok's Caves, near Ruseniko. And this is just a couple of photographs of some of the displays in the memorial. I won't read through all the details, you guys can read it at your leisure. But essentially it's summarizing this history of the people and then the battle, and then also the introduction of the missionary into the area. And then the pictures at the bottom and on the right are from a local paper, The Graphic. It was obviously quite a big thing to report on in its day. There's a picture of some of the memorials that they've established there up in a nice gabbro norite copy with King Sekwati with his pole directing the battle at the top. And then the story about how the Berlin Missionary Society of Alexander Merensky was invited to come in, as I said, in 1861, they established, in the region. And they were actually, when the battle started in 1879, or just before, I think they got warning and had to flee the area. So Hans Merensky, one of the most famous geologists, obviously associated with South Africa, although he's often considered to be German, but he was born in South Africa near Middelburg, where the family settled, at Botshabella. And also a picture of Arthur Hall, who, as you guys would probably know, undertook all the regional mapping of this area in the early part of the 1900s and published a famous memoir in 1935. And when I did my research on the discoveries some time back, I found that Merensky and Hall were convinced that platinum would occur in the eastern limb for many, many years before the discovery. And the first evidence was published by Hall and Humphrey in 1908 on platinum in chromatites. And we reckon it's probably the two chromatites sampled was the LG6 and the UG2, because they got grades of 1 to 2 grams in the LG6 and 6 to 8 grams in the UG2. But those samples were actually collected from this Sukukuni area, from the mountainous area of the eastern limb by Hans Merensky. And then another point that is quite interesting is that in 1922, Hall led a group of scientists to the eastern limb on the Shayla Memorial expedition, where they stayed for 6 weeks in the eastern limb, introducing the world really to this phenomenal geology of the region. And just from my own personal point of view, it's interesting that the expedition camped next to a discordant body of ultramafic pegmatite at Zwartkoppes, a field camp in 1922. There's a picture I dug up from the report. And that locality was one of the rocks that Percy Wagner, who's one of the other three geologists, some we can highlight from that area, from those times, who made phenomenal contribution, particularly with his book on the platinum mines and deposits of Southern Africa, published in 1929. These were the rocks that Wagner proposed to name hortonolite dunite and hortonolite wurlite pegmatite. We prefer to refer to them as ARAPs, a name that Maurice Villon and I came up with in 1985, but I sometimes wonder whether we should have stuck to the original name. Unfortunately, hortonolite is old-fashioned usage now. It's not in common usage. It just describes an olivine which is more iron-rich than a forstrite 50. And of course, Wagner's book and his descriptions are unsurpassed, really. And I think, many of us who work in the areas use these descriptions all the time. So I think, this is a sort of historical information we can put into some form of display. And the story of the discovery, I think it's relatively well known. Merensky and his Leidenberg Platinum Syndicate, they discovered the Moyhook pipe on the 15th of August, 1924. As I said, the UG2 was maybe discovered many years before, but because the platinum is too fine grained, it wasn't able to be processed, so it didn't really count as a discovery. And then the Merensky Reef was located at Montauk in 1924, September 1924, about 6 weeks later, approximately. And, and the interesting thing is that there's many exploration trenches and declines, particularly Common Vinarsuc, that we can still walk into from those periods. And the photograph on the bottom left is some different types of textured anorthosite, the blocks that they used to build a little building, which is still you can still see on GCOP, which is the locals referred to it as Merensky's office. I guess a little office that was set up as these areas were opened up. And then in the middle picture on the right, there's my favorite copies at Vinarsuc, and you can see the top picture is a historical picture from Wagner's book with a chap digging one of the trenches there, and you can see quite a large spoil heap, obviously on picking out the Merensky Reef, and it's looking to the west, so looking towards the Bushveld escarpment. The copies are in the lower main zone. And then bottom right is a picture of one of the declines at Vinarsuc that could be refurbished to create a rather fantastic historical mine, I believe. This is a picture of Merensky's map, which I managed to find from the Westphalia estate on a trip in the late 1990s with Mike Bowen, a long-time geological colleague. We were given permission to go through all the original papers. And Merensky actually documented his discoveries in several reports published in 1925, which Andrew Mitchell and I quoted in the article that we wrote on this in 2004. And I've highlighted just a few key points on the map. The Moyhook pipe, bottom right, the GCOP pipe they found next on the top of the picture. The little green squidgy things are where they map chromatite layers. They haven't differentiated UG1, UG2, but it's definitely the upper group. And then the strike of the Merensky Reef, shown with a nice line coming through here. And then the reef travels, can be traced obviously on the farm GCOP up here, and that office would be somewhere where the red symbol is now. So that's a historical map that one could use in the display. So a couple of pictures of the Donite pipes. The GCOP pipe on the top left, you can see the old glory hole where the material was worked from surface in the core, because the pipes, it's only a tiny fraction of the pipes which had the platinum in the core zones. The main body of pipe was barren Donite, and they make the Donite's relatively resistant because it's serpentinized, so they make these distinctive copies. The shaft is a original shaft, probably from those days, but these workings were used by Anglo Platinum to process the UG2 from some neighboring workings, and it was just a convenient place to build a test plant. On the top right, a picture from the Moyhook pipe of some of the rim material, the iron-rich wurlite pegmatite in the rim, draining down into the surrounding Norite. Bottom left, a picture from Onverwacht showing that the white is this reticulate veining of magnesite, and in a secondary feature due to surface serpentinization. And the brownish material is the normal Donite, and this very dark material here, which you can trace around the edges like this, is a bit of the original core, which forms a little apophysis sticking out on the side of the pipe. It's a relatively dangerous place. You can sample from the top layer. It's the only place you can get sort of in situ samples of the core material. And my samples had lots of PGM, spherulite crystals, and native platinum, because the glory hole drops down almost 50, 60 meters, I think. So it's a bit of a dangerous spot, which has been fenced off by the mining company in recent years. And on the right is a nice picture of the LG7 chromatite layer, which has been disrupted by the pipe. The rock above the chromatite is the normal pyroxenite, the normal country rock in the area, but the rock below it is a dunite related to the pipe. And that picture, you know, it could be taken sort of in the margin of the pipe, somewhere like here. So this is a section of the Onverwacht pipe showing the glory hole with the core zone, the RUP or the hortonolite dunite in the center, which was mined out down to slightly more than 800 feet. The main green is the dunite, and then the pale green is a Harzbergite transitional envelope on the outside of the pipe, which separates the dunite from the pyroxenite wall rocks, which is clearly a reaction feature. It's not a fractional crystallization product, as some people have pointed out. Just a little bit of detail on the Wacht pipe. And then this is an old mining section which I dug up in the mining office up in Pretoria, and I just annotated it with details from Wagner's book, just from his descriptions. So there's examples in the middle A4 in a layer. You know, he had samples of chromatite xenoliths, which are the broken. You could just maybe nip back and just look like that would be from here, where the LG6 has been broken up and dismembered by the pipe, and indicative of an intrusive origin, not a replacement origin. And those samples had grades of several thousand grams per ton platinum, some of the highest grades ever reported. And there's other details. You can see how the RUP material peters out with depth. It changes into different routes, 3 routes, and then eventually peters out at probably just below the 800-foot level. Because the mine was very rich, and it only worked for 4 or 5 years, but it was actually very profitable. So if we move on to the Merensky Reef at Vinard-Suk, this is a photograph taken fairly obviously in the winter, in the dry season. Everything's looking brown and washed out, and you can see the old workings of the spoil heaps on the Merensky Reef here, one here and then one further along here. So I've sketched the outcrop of the Merensky Reef along, and then you can see the footwall unit, the Merensky unit, the bastard unit, and one can walk sections here and see all the different rock types and how these units or cycles actually work. Regional dip shown on the right, 13 degrees to, you know, we're looking approximately west. This is, you know, it's a sort of area which is would be, you know, be possible to put a boardwalk down and make safe, so there's, you know, for snakes and bush and that for tourists. So, and it's about the only place in the Bushveld that we're really aware of where you can see the Merensky Reef in outcrop, not just in old workings. So the details, you can see where the platinum section of the reef is shown, and the sulfides continue in the pyroxenite above the reef. There's a leuconorite hanging wall, and you can even see the upper chromatite stringer, not in the photograph, unfortunately, but you can pick it out in the field quite easily. So all the details are there. This is on the picture on the left. That's actually Mike Bowen some years ago. We were working together on the Vinard-Suk project, looking in one of the trenches from the 1920s with those twin copies behind and the Bushveld escarpment further back. And there's another trench there where you can see the Merensky Reef pothole because of the anomalously steep dips, and you can see the upper chromatite on a rock face there. But all sorts of information can be picked up and labeled. And because it's a superb place for geological, professional geological trips, not just for geotourism. And if we look at a picture of the face with the different components of the Merensky pyroxenite and the reef labeled, and a typical borehole profile with the showing where the platinum actually occurs on the left. And the pegmatoid that is down at the bottom of the photograph. Here it weathers much more deeply. And the big difference, of course, of the eastern limb is that the platinum is not in the pegmatoid, it's mostly higher up in the pyroxenite. And this is a key feature that Andrew Mitchell and I have discussed in some of our papers to support our sill model. At the top of the sill, would actually be here, where you get this very unusual contact of the pyroxenite with the hanging wall leuconorite or anorthosite, spotted anorthosite in this photo. So some of the contacts that maybe were referred to as primary igneous layering, over the years can be re-looked at and given a different interpretation. And as part of the work at Vinasuk, when I was involved, we took a bulk sample, blasted out a new stope down at depth in that decline 28, which was on the last picture. And this sort of thing probably could be made safe, and tourists could be taken down, and as I said, to create a sort of platinum reef city if the mining company and the community can buy into it. And in the workings, we cut several hundred channels with a diamond saw, and they've all been assayed and plotted up on diagrams. So these particular channels, the one on the left, AM, is in that decline 28, a few tens of meters below surface. One can easily walk down and see it and label them all up and show where the platinum fits in and the details. If we take this channel here, you can see the leuconorite in the hanging wall, the upper chrome, the pyroxenite, the lower chrome, and the pegmatoid. And the different rock types stand out relatively clearly. If we just do a quick whiz through some of the other components of the intrusion, the marginal zone's got all sorts of interesting features. A rheomorphic breccia on the right at Hendriksplatz, the migmatite indicative of these two UNA magmas at the Grooteboom on the left. Both of those explanations have always been hugely reliant on Martin Sharp's work. Martin would have written papers on this many years ago, and in his guidebook is extremely detailed with many more sites than we covered in my IGC trip that I took, and he's got excellent descriptions of all of these sites and possible origins. And then on the right, another locality that Martin Sharp has described, the tennis ball marker, at the famous Tontadus locality. All sorts of interesting geosites, obviously, which can be labeled up. This is a picture from Morris Viljoen, of course, showing the layering in the lower zone in the Olifants River trough, with a lower bronzitite or lower orthopyroxenite subzone on the right, the upper bronzitite on the left, and the Hartsbergite subzone in the center with minor bronzitite or orthopyroxenite in the middle of that subzone. And the general explanation would be that there's been intrusion of a big batch of magma to make this bronzitite, which I find a very difficult rock to understand because it's 99.5% made up of OPX. It's a monomineralic rock. And the Hartsbergite would be due to replenishment with possibly comarchitic magmas based on some of Alan Wilson's latest work, with fractional crystallization, and then another intrusion of this bronzitite magma, like accumulate up on to complete the subzone. But Andrew and I believe this could be related, reinterpreted using our idea of sills, that the bronzitites were originally joined and essentially a comarchitic magma is intruded as a sill in the middle of it with relic pieces of bronzitite left behind. Just an alternative explanation to throw in. So the layering in the bronzitites or the orthopyroxenite is you get this fantastic alignment of crystals in the lower zone there at the Yaklas locality. The Donites and the Hartsbergites weathered to make this lots of magnesite veining, and you get this distinctive heliochrysum flower here, not flowering in this particular picture. So very easy to see the Donite identify the rocks and from each other, and this would be some bronzitite in the background. And the Donites rarely outcrop because they weather so deeply. So the main Donite one finds in little gullies, as shown here, and it's quite a nice spot to be able to go and sample a relatively fresh Donite. And if we nip into the lower critical zone, some of the most spectacular layering is interlaying of hartspicite and orthoperoxenite at the Wintersveld locality, which is just a few kilometers from Yaglast, where there's a nice exposure of the LG4. We look at some of the chromatites, LG6 on the left, with there's the LG6, a meter or so wide, meter and a half wide, LG6A, the leader scene here. Oh, my labeling went a bit funny there, apologies for that. On the right is the MG3, and the key thing to point out is Xenoliths, which we believe is good evidence of the models of Hugh eels, where the chromatites are related to replenishment of the chamber by magmas full of chromite slurries. And then at the same locality, you get this little thin chromatite on the contact of a peroxenite and an anorthosite, which we call magmatic reaction chromites. And all of these localities are the G15 geosite. And on the right is just showing, you know, a face, the orbicular texture that you see on a face of the reaction chromite, you know, rimming the peroxenite. One of these intriguing features that we've looked at for many years, and it's only recently we've really thought how it could work. So this would be our still idea here, let the norite below, anorthosite above. This is from my work with Gabby Costin, published a couple of years ago. So the magma's in place as a laterally in place sill and forms a magmatic reaction chromite on the contact with the anorthosite, all based on Irvine's work with phase diagrams many years ago. But without the sill idea, of course, then the chromite would be in the middle of a cycle, so it's difficult to explain. This is a nice slide from one of the chromite mines in the southern sector of the eastern limb, just showing the upper critical zone, lower critical zone boundary, you know, with the anorthosite above there and the different chromatite layers and the peroxenite. I should have mentioned this is Morris's picture, and he labeled it as well. And if we look at just a few pictures of the UG1 from the Dwyersville locality, you know, there's all sorts of fascinating structures there, that you know, xenoliths of anorthosite in the chromite on the left, and then the footwall stringers on the right, and then on the bottom right, where the highlight is one of these dendritic mottles, which we would suggest has grown down from the contact. You know, an indication that the anorthosite's been heated up and essentially intruded by a chromite magma, if one wants to put it like that. So it's only really, you know, the way Andrew Mitchell and I see it anyway, it's only really with Hugh Eales's work in the 2000s, I think 2004, he first published it, that the magmas, the recharge was with magmas which were so full of chromite that they actually, you know, chromite crystals, that they made slurries, which then penetrated into the footwall in some of these localities, as allow us to really understand these relationships. And then the dendritic mottles is an indication of heating of the anorthosite and interstitial melt draining downwards. Not everything goes up in the Bushveld. If we look at the UG2, another photograph that Morris contributed to our 2019 paper, shows the UG2 at the Hackney locality, up on the cliffs above the Hackney, or the Twickenham mine on the Hackney property. It's like G11 on our geosite, just showing the UG2. Again, you can see xenoliths in the UG2, and the xenoliths of anorthosite and peroxenite, and many features here which don't come out hugely clearly in the photograph, indicative of an intrusive origin. And there's, you know, quite clearly you can see the pegmatoidal peroxenite in the footwall. The details shown on the right with the platinum grades from a borehole that Morris managed to get from the mine. If we look at nip up into the main and upper zone, just a couple of pictures again. You know, so this is the main mottled anorthosite, one of these huge, you know, monomineralic layers, which present as many problems to understand as the chromatites do in the Bushveld. So, you know, a big thick layer of anorthosite. On the right is the peroxenite marker. I haven't labeled it as a geosite because it's a long walk from the road on the Moy-Mazes Fontaine property. At the bottom picture of the main magnetite layer that many of you might have visited at Magnet Heights with some of the participants on the IGC trip 2016, which is quite close to one of the villages. So we had a few of the local residents came to see what we were doing, and was very sort of nice, friendly, interactive experience for people from overseas. And then on the right, from the same locality, the way the magnetite layer makes a nice nice rock pavement, which I think is quite a fascinating feature to many people interested in geology. And then the final slide, the idea being is that we could use this Zati heritage site, would be the natural center of the geopark or geotrail. And you know, if we could enter into discussions with the curator, you know, there's a full-time two ladies that I've met who curate the site. You know, they're fairly obviously all the time. I think that's one of the ladies standing here. You know, we could actually interact with the people and see if the local community would be interested in establishing a geotrail. And the first step would be to get some boards and information, you know, in this particular locality. And as I said before, the next step would be to get the mining companies involved and see if we could establish some of the old mining sites. But I think the local community is key to the whole thing. And I would like to see, as a final comment, if there, I mean, I know there are geologists from the Sekukuni community, you know, who are now, you know, fully established, you know, geologists with degrees and, you know, even postgrad degrees and what have you, or working in the area or working on theses at the universities, of WITS, for example. You know, maybe they would be the perfect people to drive this forward and take it away from old timers like Morris and myself. So that's the talk. Thank you very much for listening. Do I do a stop share? Would that be the story?
Well, you might as well leave the picture up, Roger. Thanks
very
much.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I'd like to open it up to questions and comments at this point in time. Maybe I'd like to start with a point of philosophy here. I mean, to me, I'm not a Bushveld geologist at all, but it is a fascinating bit of geology, which is pretty complicated. And it seems to me that there could easily be a bit of an admissibility gap between what a complete novice to the geological sciences would like to see and to what a professional geologist would like to see compared to what the local community would like to see. How do we bridge that gap? I mean, it seems to me it has to be pretty carefully done. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's the same with my GeoTraveler articles. You know, the idea that you can write articles for the professional geologist, which are not too dumbed down, and at the same time for educated lay people, is really quite difficult. And you know, it's not an easy gap to bridge. And I think, you know, but I think with display boards one could do it, because one could have a more general display, you know, with very more simple descriptions of the rock types and the layers and that, and then a more detailed one with the explanation of how it forms. I mean, my experience, you know, from going to some of the national parks, Yellowstone would be an obvious example. You know, that you go on these geological walks. Arches would be the same, where they're national parks guys who've just gotten interested in geology. So they have they don't necessarily have degrees, you know, they've often got a tertiary qualification in tourism or whatever, but they pick up the geology quickly. And I think we'd be amazed how quickly the people, the indigenous, the local people would pick up all of the sufficient geological principles to pass it on. And I say that with confidence because I've noticed that with my work in East Africa. You go on these tours, most people, it's not like South Africa where people self-drive to the parks. Most people go on tours, and the guides are hugely competent on everything other than geology. But within a few days of teaching them, you know, they seem to pick it up incredibly quickly. So I believe it can be done quite easily. But yeah, the key without doubt is to get the local community to say what they want, and then build it from there and see how it develops.
Other questions, queries, comments?
Yeah, Roger, Richard here. I think it was a fantastic talk. There's amazing geology, that's for sure. But I have the same kind of questions in a way as Craig, and that is, if you could do a one-day tour through the area, or you could do a 6-day tour. or you could do a tour with a bunch of non-geologists, just normal tourists for one day, etc., etc. So there are different types of people and different lengths of tours. So maybe perhaps one could consider a general tour for the interested layman going to the Kruger Park, as you mentioned earlier on. And as you said, display boards would be pretty good as well. And the locals, that's a good idea. But I think there needs to be a bit of a sequence, So it's a complicated story, and to put it across in a sequence, I think, is the big trick here. Where do you start and where do you end? And maybe the accent should be on the Platinum Trail or something like that for the average tourist. But there are many ways of doing it. And then also the production of brochures, I think, is important, but they've got to be probably at different levels. Just speaking to the people in Barberton now, for example, the Maconjwa Trail, they have one brochure, but they realize they need about 3 different brochures. So they're working on different brochures now for different interests. So I think all these factors come into play, as you've alluded to, but what a fantastic geological gem we've got here. It's a matter now of taking it further and how we do that. So no, that's pretty good, Roger. I think you've set a good scene there.
No, thanks, Richard. It's very kind of you to say so. Yeah, no, well, the idea to link it to the Kruger tourism was first planted to me by Morris. And of course, to get to this Jati centre, it's a bit of a dirt road, the last 5 Ks. So that's the sort of thing that the local authority would have to work on and get the road sorted out. So if you go on a tour bus to, the Eastern Escarpment and the Kruger, this could be added in as a stop on the way. And I think people would enjoy it because it's an extremely rugged country, as you can see from the pictures, much more maybe than many people realize. And of course, the Sukukuni people, they established their fortress in the Jati Valley for good reason, because of the mountains. So there's a whole geological reason that the people set up there as well. They obviously felt safer, and it's a sort of, I would imagine if you dressed it up with some modern tourist type talk, you could really make it a phenomenal place that people would like to go and see, from overseas more now than maybe local people. But unfortunately, you're right in the sense that you need a multi-pronged approach and several brochures and maybe even several types of information board. But the one thing that we shouldn't worry about is getting hung up about how the rocks form. When you go on these sort of trips in the American parks, it's really to point features out rather than actually say how it formed. I think as geologists, we're all obsessed with how did it really form. And the idea that you can see a little reaction chromite, I think that's good enough for many people. Exactly how it formed, well, does that really matter?
Roger, could I step in quickly?
One could
okay.
Carry on, Clyde.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I'd show a picture as well, so Roger doesn't have to be the only picture. Just a couple of things. I think from a general visitor point of view, I would focus on the geological control of the geomorphology, almost as you alluded to with the location of areas of safety, because the control on the geomorphology of the layered complex, for example, is fascinating. And then just a second point, you might find it easier to explain mechanisms to lay people than to people with preconceived geological ideas. So I wouldn't necessarily think it would be difficult to explain things to people who knew nothing about geology, and perhaps easier than to explain it to people who know a lot about geology. But thanks, that's just my comments.
Thanks, Clyde. And the geomorphology side, you're absolutely right, because we've overlooked it for many years, and you almost need to go back to Hall's original work to actually, to read about it. I don't think there's much in between. So, we could get geomorphologists to come in and add to that side of it as well, because Morris and I have only done a pretty preliminary look at it, I guess.
Are there plans to put together an actual project plan with a budget and timelines and things like that?
No, there's nothing at all. Morris and I, we've written in GeoBulletin a few times over the years to try to get things going. You know, we called it the Platinum Trail at one stage, but it's never really got off the ground because it's our fault a little bit. We're too far, I guess, from Joburg, from the action to get it going. And, you know, and you have to go and have a lot of meetings with the local people. And unfortunately, that puts me off because although it's extremely fun and rewarding, it takes up too much time. And I just haven't really got that opportunity at the moment. And that's what I was saying. I think what we should do is we should appoint people, geologists who come from the region, who speak the language, and they're really part of that local community. And one suggestion that Morris and I have explored recently would be to see if one could put a PhD together, and Wits would be the logical place because it's closer to the action, or Pretoria maybe, and actually do a PhD on the geoheritage possibilities of the Bushveld and focus on all of these different issues, somewhat different to the normal, looking at the layering and the intricacies of the mineralogy, and maybe restrict it to somebody from the community, if that's possible.
Thanks, Roger. Just referring to Clyde's idea, I think this idea of relating the Bushveld to the Middelveld, it puts things in a regional context. But in terms of the timelines, we're coming up for the 100th anniversary of the Shaler Memorial Expedition. So maybe it'd be an idea to retrace Hall's footsteps in 2022.
Yeah, sounds a good idea, and it's 100. I mean, even the discovery, 100 years would be 2024. It's not so far away, is it? Time goes by quickly, as I think we all find as we get older. So there's the timing, could be really good, actually, I must say. And I think what we need to do is we need to, as a society, I guess, agree that the way forward is to promote it to the local community and try to get the guys to appreciate that not only is it good to protect geoheritage, but it can bring tourism into the region, and tourism is always going to be a better way to earn a living than mining because it's sustainable over many years. And we could get figures from some of the similar situations from overseas. And if any of you saw my geotraveler on the Malvern Hills geopark in, I can't remember, was it December last year? I mean, it's a trivial little thing with a few little low hills, which you walk up in 10 minutes, but they get some unbelievable number of people visit every year. And Lyme Regis and Charmouth on the south coast, the Jurassic Park with all the Jurassic fossils, I think they get over 1 million visitors a year or something crazy. So, we could, we should be maybe thinking of tapping into this type of market. We'd never get those numbers, but I'm sure we'd get a lot more people than we think if it gets set up properly and well advertised.
Roger, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, hi, Morris. Yeah,
yes,
hi,
there. Hi, Roger. Hi, everyone. Yeah, no, Roger, excellent talk. And I go along with all the comments that have been made, some very useful comments there, so I won't reiterate, but just to say that I think it is important to have a holistic kind of a tour. In other words, bringing in all aspects, as you've done, in fact, the geomorphology, of course, the geology, and then the cultural history. And I've done several tours there, one with the Archaeological Society, visiting a lot of pretty interesting archaeological sites, and perhaps one could elaborate a bit more on those. People always like the human side. You didn't mention Mapok's Cave, but there are other sites, and I agree that Jati, which is on the view now, is a pretty good locality for an interpretive center. And the person to contact here is a guy by the name of Udo Kusel. He's a guy who put this thing up. He took us on the archaeological trip through the Eastern Bushveld. I actually outlined the geology, and he gave the archaeological side. So it was quite a useful trip. And he put the display up, and he's an ideal guy. He's at the National Cultural History Museum in Pretoria. I'm not sure if he might have retired now, but he is really passionate about this area, and he'd be a good guy to liaise with as far as setting up some kind of interpretive center at Jati. And as you mentioned, I think the mine is another good one, because it is within the mine area, so it's from a safety security point of view, the mine, the Vinars Hook locality would be a good spot as well to have some kind of interpretive center. And the mine, I'm sure, would be amenable to making this a site that involves the local community, a part of their social and labor plan, which all mines are concentrating on these days. So there's another contact that I think one could follow up on with these ideas. And incidentally, the trip that I took, which was from Eastern Bushveld to Kruger, we stopped one night in this area. We stayed at that Katlani Lodge, and within that time, in a total of about 1 day, we managed to see some of the most, all the important sites, I would say. It was obviously fairly quick, but nevertheless, they got a view of the main site. So I reckon you need probably 2 days to get and you could see much of that area. And then, the idea of the link to Kruger Park, I think, is a good one, in that, people always want to go to Kruger, and you might as well do this on the way down and introduce people to a whole lot of other fascinating stuff. So, yeah, thanks, Roger. It's a really good idea, I think, to develop this concept.
Yeah, thanks, Morris. It's nice extra comments to take into account. There's no doubt the archaeology, which both of us are interested in, could be woven into a much bigger picture. I was going to add it into the talk, but I thought it would just get too long, so I just sort of mentioned it, if you like. And then the other point that you raised about contacting the chap who put the Jati Centre together. I mean, that's obviously would be a good first step. So maybe Chris, as a geoheritage leader, could get the ball rolling on this. If people think it's a worthwhile enterprise. And I guess one could add as well that, Vinars Hook, the mine, the Marula mine, is operated by Impala. And I mean, they've been unbelievably supportive of me popping up every couple of years to continue my research and sampling core. And every time I want to take a trip, they just say yes almost automatically, and they host us and look after us. And, on the IGC thing, they gave us lunch there and a whole lot. I find I'd be very surprised if they weren't happy to support and put in reasonable money to get something going. We obviously can't speak on their behalf, but it would obviously be a very good social program for a mining company to do, and employ people, local shift bosses, with tickets, if we could manage to get people to go underground, or even just local guys to guide people around the outcrop. And I think you've got to build walkways, because people don't want to be in that nasty bushveld grass and snakes around and that. One needs a proper walkway and that. So then there would be opportunities for jobs in just to get it going in the beginning and maintain it and secure it. I think it's a bit of a win-win situation.
I noticed from the chat box that one of our participants is named Merensky Tao, who is one of the locals very interested in this project. So you should be in contact with Roger and Morris, I think. Yeah,
Merensky sent me his details, and I didn't see him come on. But Mary, I'm glad you have come on, and I think you would be, a perfect position to maybe try to help drive the whole program forward if you're interested in. You've got time to do so, maybe working with Chris rather than Morris and I, because we're sort of a little bit far away at the moment. But, we can help from the outside a little bit. But there's no doubt, it takes a lot of work. I know this from Vinars Hook, where we had literally, I wouldn't say hundreds, but, many dozens of meetings of the local community to make sure that when we were drilling there and got the mine going, everything worked smoothly. And it's very rewarding and good fun, but it does take up a lot of time. So yeah, Merensky, you'll be a perfect in a perfect position to do something like this.
But I'll let the two of you be in contact with one another. Are there any other questions, comments, queries?
If I may, this is Bob Trumbull speaking. I don't know, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, I'm in Germany. I think many of the people involved in the talk, and thank you for this great talk, Roger. Many of you know that there's an ICDP drilling initiative, which will be which has been funded by the ICDP, but needs co-funding, and the co-funding stage is going on right now. If we're lucky, I think we would possibly be able to start operation of an ICDP hole in 2022. The site of this hole is scheduled to be in the Marula mine property on the eastern limb, and I'm in contact with Morris and with Roger. We've kicked around the idea of making this geoheritage thing, taking it one step further and making it a UNESCO geosite. And I'm just putting it out to you that there could be some follow-up on this. Going for the UNESCO world site is considerably bureaucratic. There's multi-stage proposals that get put in. There has to be an institution which is willing to host the whole thing. So it may be it may be too much for the moment, but I just want to put it out there that this is a possibility. And I think an excellent one, because we all agree this is a wonderful global site, to if it turns into something, let's say on a smaller scale in the next few months or a couple of years, it could actually develop into something bigger. And UNESCO is a member of the ICDP as a contributing partner. So I think that also has some legs possibly. Thank you.
Yeah, hi Bob. We've emailed each other a little bit, haven't we? So good to hear from you, and those comments as well. So yeah, no, if the two the drilling and the geopark could be joined together, that would be great. As you know, I've expressed my doubts on the drilling because I'm just not convinced that these single borehole profiles add anything to the geological understanding. But then that's a slightly different take on it. I believe we should be looking in 3 dimensions and start a sort of new approach to understanding the Bushveld geology, if you like. But that's just a personal view. But if the things could be linked together, and if you guys have got access to money which could be used, anything is better than nothing to get things going, that would be fantastic.
We won't debate about the 3D approach to understanding Bushveld. I agree with you absolutely 100%. As far as money and benefit to the local communities, to South Africa and to the world, I think we should be serious about trying to turn this into a UNESCO site. Certainly, if you look at Bushveld, this is one of the few places where people can walk around and see things. And I was impressed today to learn about the Tsate heritage, which I hadn't known about before. So it looks like there's quite a lot of other things that are interesting in the region apart from the geology.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And we, maybe if you next time you come across, or we try to organize some form of visit, and we get as many people from the interested from the geological side as well as local community and together, and the mining company representatives, and try to do a proper a visit and look around. It's always more rewarding to discuss these things in the field than sitting back in the office.
Roger, could I make a comment, please?
Go ahead, Clyde.
Of course.
Yeah. Roger, I'm doing quite a lot of work with various people on what is often referred to as life after mining. So we're looking at stuff in the western limb of the Bushveld. We're looking obviously at the coal fields of Mpumalanga. We're looking at areas in the Witwatersrand where mining no longer takes place. And one of the things that always strikes one is that it's better to start this while there's still mining taking place than to try and do it when the mining is actually stopped. In other words, trying to get the different mining companies to coordinate their CSI spend in looking at establishing sustainable ongoing practices that will take place after mining is finished and things have been restored. So I think working with mining companies that are active still in the Eastern Bushveld, but have got, you know, some of them might be reaching end of life or whatever it happens to be. It's very important to get the different companies to coordinate their community spend rather than each one try and do it on their own, as it were. And I've worked quite closely with Professor Robert Solomon at UCT, ex-CEO of, was it Resizwe Platinum in the Western?
He was at
So there's a lot of action in this area at the moment, and that just strikes me as being slightly more sustainable than trying to do the heritage trails and things in isolation. So the other thing I just would like to comment on, and I don't know, I haven't been to this area for some time, are there places, lodges or areas where people can stay a night or two to turn it into a kind of an overnight or two overnight experience, as opposed to just a quick in and out? Because it's in those sort of areas where there's opportunity to grow far more jobs and tourism opportunities than if you're just passing through, so to speak.
Yeah, no, for sure. What you said, Clyde, all makes sense. On the mining side, you know, I think Morris and I realize that the mining companies, you know, we need them to come to the party. Otherwise, it just couldn't work. You know, we need their finance, but, you know, you need their just general support, really, you know, and it's logical that the two big players in the area, Anglo Platinum and Impala, you know, would work together. There's no reason to imagine otherwise. Mooihoek, Onderwijk, whatever, you know, they're closer to the Anglo mines, or actually on their property, and Nozip's on the Impala property, as you know. So that would all make sense. And fortunately, the Marula mine's going relatively well, and I think they've put in quite a lot of capex in recent years. I don't think there's much chance of it closing up, but I appreciate that it's good to strike while the iron's hot type of thing. And then the last point, yeah, no, there's plenty of places to stay. And as Morris mentioned, you know, on these IGC trips, and I think on every field trip that Morris and I and Andrew Mitchell have taken over the years, we always stay at the Kaflani Lodge, which is, you know, it's probably slightly short of 5-star, but it's very good, you know, and it's got animals there as well, you know, a few zebra and let me think, I don't know what else is there, you know, Impala and what have you, and giraffe, yeah, and people love it. I mean, the IGC trip I took, there was 34 people, only 2 local, and all the international people loved it. They thought it was the most fantastic place, you know. So, and it's not that far away. So yeah, no, and because of the tarred roads, other than the last 5Ks to Jati, you know, the access is really pretty good, you know. So I think, you know, the fundamentals are there. It's just a matter of getting it going. We need somebody to drive it on. You know, Morris and I talk about it, but we don't quite get it off the ground, would be the truth of the matter.
Right. Before I close the meeting, last chance, any more comments or queries?
My cat's feeling left out. She just jumped up. Yeah.
Just one comment here on your last thing about, you know, accommodation in the area. And we're finding that this might just be happening in the Fudafort Dome at the moment, where the idea was to have an information center perhaps in Parys, but why not have an information center, and this may be a little bit controversial, at Getlani Lodge, and then people could work from there and overnight, etc., or as one of the information centers.
Well, yeah, it's a good idea, Richard, and there's no reason you can't repeat it. If you're printing off information boards, it's just as cheap to print 2 as 1, I imagine, and you know, the actual board and put in the wood up and the concrete, you know, pillars, you know, the foundations, you could just repeat it there, and there is a little bit of a small geological information there as well. So, and there's even a little geotrail you can walk up on the hill there.
So the owners would buy into collaborating on this. Obviously, it's good for their business, that's for sure.
No, I'm sure they would, unless they've changed. It does change ownership every now and then, that place, unfortunately. Yeah. But I think it would be fine. And all the staff are local, and they've been there for years and years. Every time I go there, they always say, "Oh, Roger, haven't you retired yet?" So, you know, it's like, which is a good question, but so, yeah, there's huge continuity of people there, and the barman and the, you know, the people who serve you and the chef in the kitchen, and they're all from the local community. And yeah, I mean, you know, they realize that the mining and geology is a key part of their business, because we take a lot of trips over the years if you add them all up, you know.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, with that, I think I'd like to close the meeting, but first, Roger, a big thanks for this. Some fantastic photography, some fantastic concepts. I think it's very important. Chris is no doubt thinking about how to make all this stuff sort of gel. So maybe this is the start of something much bigger. I would hope so. Thank you for the participants coming in, and I see we've had Bob Turnbull from Germany. I don't know if we've had any other countries represented, but thanks a lot, everybody. And with that, I'll close the meeting.
Thanks,
So
Greg,
thank you
Chris.
much. Thanks.
Yeah, and thanks everybody
Thanks,
for listening
Roger. Thanks.
and all the questions. Thank you.
Thanks.